The average tariff on the Indian side is 39%. The average tariff on all goods on the US side is 5%. And that's a huge gap to bridge. So I think there is clear willingness to strike this deal, and especially amidst what's happening in Asia broadly in terms of supply chains. Greater market access for the United States in agriculture sector, dairy products, for instance, is going to really destabilize the domestic industry.
Can the US and India strike a deal? Vice President J.D. Vance met with Prime Minister Narendra Modi this week, and India's top trade negotiator is heading to DC. For more, we're joined by Vivek Mishra of the Observer Research Foundation, which is based in Delhi. Vivek, thank you very much for joining us. The Finance Minister of India said this week that the first phase of the pact could be signed by autumn of this year. What do we know about the negotiations?
Thank you for having me. I think the terms of the reference have been signed between India and the US, which means it gives it a set roadmap for the next few months to achieve this deal. And I think broadly, if you look at the India-US joint statement, which was brought out when Prime Minister Modi visited the US, that reference, that joint statement gives a date of about September of fall 2025. I think what the J.D. Vance's visit has done is really lay out the map for the first quarter or the second quarter in terms of what sectors the two countries are going to achieve and what sectors are the two countries are going to prioritize. And I think in terms of the specifics of negotiation, and February and April 23rd, which is today, I think the negotiations are set to start. So the initial set of visits from both sides were really to lay the ground for this visit and really the terms of reference, which was signed a few days back.
OK, well, you mentioned J.D. Vance. He had this to say about the ongoing talks this week.
Americans want further access to Indian markets. This is a great place to do business, and we want to give our people more access to this country. And Indians, we believe, will thrive from greater commerce in the United States. This is very much a win-win partnership. It certainly will be far into the future.
So, Vivek, from what we know about this deal, do you think it has the potential to be a win-win?
I think so. I mean, if you look at the approaches of the two sides, it's been completely different from the past, which means India has shown the willingness to be a little conciliatory than the past, and the United States is actually not talking top down to India, and that refrain you constantly heard in J.D. Vance's speech, where he clearly laid out that our approach is going to be different. The main sticking point is, of course, that the average tariff on the Indian side is 39%. The average tariff on all goods on the US side is 5%, and that's a huge gap to bridge. And I think that's going to be more challenging for two countries, particularly India, in terms of bringing it down. But I think in the budget that India announced this year, they've already shown the willingness to bring the tariffs down for specific US sectors like bourbon whiskey, automobiles, etc. So I think there is clear willingness to strike this deal, and especially amidst what's happening in Asia broadly in terms of supply chains. I think there is significant will on both sides.
OK, but Trump paused and only paused his initial tariffs that he put on India for 90 days. There's still the blanket tariff, but then there's the tariff on India, which would come back in theoretically within 90 days. But do you think that India can expect a continuation of the tariff pause at least until the deal is done?
I think the scramble on the other side is really to finish at least a section of this deal in the 90 days period. And because we are in the talks, so if it exceeds 90 days, I'm expecting that there will be some leeway to go forward because we'll be in the middle of talks. But I think it would be not right to really expect a carve out for India amidst everything, amidst a blanket tariff. So I think the talks really will lay out if there is an exception at the later stage or not. But clearly, I think the manner in which J.D. Vance's visit has come, and then later this year you have President Trump perhaps visiting India for the Quad summit. I think there is a broad line. There is a deadline for September for the Trump administration to and the Indian government to really announce something by this fall.
Okay, you sound quite optimistic, but things haven't always been smooth sailing when it comes to the trade relationships between those two sides. And when it comes to this deal, or the deal that they're still negotiating, who knows what it could look like in the end? What have the sticking points been so far?
So the main sticking points are particular sectors which India has traditionally not been open in, and some of those are agriculture. For instance, I mean, the subsidies that the government gives to farmers is a point which is sticking point, because then and greater market access for the United States in agriculture sector, dairy products, for instance, is going to really destabilize the domestic industry. And I think that India has drawn certain red lines. What is important is that the question for India is, what are the other ways in which it can, for both India and the US, is what are the other ways in which India and the US can circumvent some of these sectors? So one of the ways which I think, and this is completely my view, that you can circumvent this problem of sectoral tariffs is to leave out some sectors which are, of course, sensitive for both countries, and particularly for India, and instead work out deals in areas like defense, in areas like energy, which was a harping point for J.D. Vance in his speech, where he said that the United States looks to be one of the greatest exporters of energy to India. So I think if you redo the math, then I think the sectors' advantages and certain sensitive sectors, the sensitivity around certain sectors can be left out and be made up in other sectors that India imports in heavily.
Okay, but I just want to go in a bit deeper on what you were saying about agriculture. One of the most vocal criticisms comes from India's agricultural community. In fact, the country's oldest farmers' union has expressed strong opposition. So isn't this deal going to hurt Indian farmers? Because if the US has more access to Indian markets, that increases competition there, and that could leave Indian farmers worse off.
Absolutely, it could if it gets a greater market, and I think that sensitivity stands true for the Indian community, particularly the farmer community. But I think the government is cognizant of this. If you've seen the sensitivity around MSP, the minimum support price, which the government offers for certain for certain grains and farm products, I don't think there is much scope for moving that around, and therefore carve-outs, and therefore alternate strategies in terms of investments, in terms of other areas of newer areas of imports, or expanding existing areas of mega imports like defense, energy could be alternatives to really leave sectors like agriculture out and still reach the math that both countries intend to sectorally.
Okay, but looking at the editorials in Indian newspapers, there's a clear concern that India could be bullied into a deal. And China is threatening to punish countries that do a deal to its disadvantage, and India-Chinese relations are very sensitive, as we know. So is there a risk that India is sacrificing its strategic autonomy to appease Donald Trump?
Oh, absolutely not. I think, this India's strategic autonomy remains intact, and independent decision-making remains intact. If you saw anything in the last few years during the war that is going on in Europe, India's decision-making was stress-tested like never before, despite the US pressure, the back-channel pressure during the Joe Biden administration, and so on and so forth. If anything, the road from here gets easier because it's one, for, of course, the fact that there is Donald Trump, and second, of course, that the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine is being facilitated perhaps to an end. So I think the road from here is easier in terms of decision making and China. I think the complicated relationship with China continues despite a thaw in October last year, because there is a huge mistrust on both sides, which both sides are now trying to work out and come to a meeting ground. If that happens, it's good for the stability of the region. But I think in terms of Chinese investments and trade, there is a cautious approach from India that continues.
Okay, I think, that stress test point is definitely very important. I think you're right there. But a big question that's been swirling around the tariffs is whether India could actually stand to benefit from the trade war in the sense that if it continues or intensifies between the US and China, that many companies that manufacture in China may wish to shift some of their manufacturing to India. And of course, India is a country which has been trying to boost its manufacturing for a while now. There's been several campaigns to try and get more manufacturing done inside India. What do you think about the chances of that?
So I think if you look at the design of Trump tariffs and the percentage on China, it's certainly expected to lead to supply chain deflections. And if you also add that to the point that there is South Asia, there's Southeast Asia, where specific points of Belt and Road Initiative have been hit with tariffs, because obviously these became junctions for China to deflect goods easily into other markets without much tariff. For example, Vietnam, if these countries really go on to strike a deal with the US of some kind, then I think China is in a spot. And that's why you see increasing pressure from China in the narrative that it is warning countries not to do so. But eventually countries will hedge. Smaller countries will hedge, bigger countries will align. And I think that's where it's going to be. You're already also seeing a narrative from the Commerce Ministry of India to actually woo companies to India instead of China. So I think we are positioning ourselves to be able to do that. But how much of that supply chain reflection will you really absorb is a question for India to ponder on.
Okay, and now India has tried to embrace a non-aligned stance. You talked about the thaw in the relationship between China and India. Modi has met with Chinese President Xi. Both are large players in BRICS, for example. Do you think this geopolitical stance will survive the Trump administration?
I think so. The point about stress testing India's decision making now in organizations like BRICS and SCO, it's emerging as a new ground where India participates in a much broader space. Remember, both SCO and BRICS have been expanded than in the past, and therefore the decision making is more democratic in many ways. But there are certain points that India is not on board. For example, BRICS's idea of de-dollarization. India has consistently made the point that India is not for de-dollarization because fundamentally we are integrated to the Western economy, into the global economy, and we don't want to carve out a niche of certain countries which want to deal in their own currencies. So I think on certain points, India is pretty clear in terms of how it wants to go forward. Will that be tested? Of course, I think it will be tested because depending on how the Russia-Ukraine war goes, and if the eventual option of the Trump administration, which is to impose tariffs on Russia if Russia does not come to the table, then I think the energy importers all across the world from Russia, including India, will be impacted.
Okay, now just to end back where we started on the potential trade deal, of course you'll be following this very closely over the coming weeks and months. What signals will you be looking for to try and assess the viability and the potential of this trade deal as we go through the next few months?
So I think, one of the things that I'll be closely watching is what happens to India's sensitive sectors. How much is India able to draw that line in certain sectors, and whether there is, I'm not sure if all these sectors will be protected to the fullest, but I think they will have to drop the tariffs in certain sectors. So that will be a key area to watch. The other area is, of course, investments. You see that United States and India have consistently, since Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, have announced that both countries will invest in each other countries. And I think that will be a key thing to watch, because here you have two countries which are harping on the idea of Make in India and Make in America. And how does that really come together in terms of prioritizing your own domestic industry, but yet collaborating between yourselves? And the third is, of course, what the defense systems and the co-production that the two countries have promised to do in India. So I think in the next 4 to 5 years, much of these will unravel in terms of what are the systems that the two countries are going to make, and what does it really impact, and how does it really impact the Indo-Pacific in terms of building regional deterrence and having a favorable balance of power.
Okay, so more stress tests to come. Vivek Mishra with the Observer Research Foundation, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.